New Orleans in 1858 was a city of contradictions, a place where beauty and brutality walked side by side in the same streets, where the sound of church bells mixed with the wails of chained men being led to market, where the perfume of magnolia blossoms floated over gutters running thick with rot and river mud. The city had grown fat from trade, its warehouses stacked with sugar and cotton, its port teeming with ships that had crossed the Atlantic and the Gulf, its streets crowded with French, Spanish, Creole, and African tongues. But under all its glittering surface, New Orleans was a city that thrived on human suffering, and the Duval family were among those who profited from that order. Their mansion stood like a pearl at the edge of Esplanade Avenue, its balcony railings ornate, its gardens meticulously tended, its very appearance announcing wealth and respectability to anyone passing by. People spoke of the Duvals as an honorable family, as good Catholics who never missed Mass, who gave alms to the poor, who hosted elegant dinners for priests and politicians alike, who embodied the ideal of Southern refinement. Yet the air in New Orleans was thick with more than just humidity. It was a place where whispers carried as easily as the sound of hymns, where rumors of misfortune spread faster than news of good fortune, where the dead never seemed to stay buried for long, and the living carried their ghosts in every gesture and glance. It was a city of candlelight vigils and voodoo altars, of sanctified processions and secret rites in the swamps beyond the levees, where faith was both a shield and a weapon. As Holy Week approached, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. Churches swelled with the faithful, their pews packed with men and women seeking confession, candles burning until the wax pooled on the stone floors. The streets grew quieter as Good Friday neared, taverns lowering their voices, markets closing early, as though the city itself was aware of the weight of the days to come. In the Duval house, preparations for the sacred week were always elaborate. The silver was polished to a shine, fresh flowers were cut from the garden, the family's finest clothes laid out for Sunday Mass, everything in its place, the very rhythm of the house adjusted to match the solemnity of the church calendar. Beneath this order, however, there were shadows that did not show themselves in polite company. The enslaved people who worked the household moved like ghosts through the rooms, tending fires, sweeping hallways, caring for the children while keeping their own griefs buried deep. Among them was Esther, who had lived in the Duval household for nearly a decade, a woman of striking stillness and dark, watchful eyes. She was trusted with the care of the youngest children, trusted to wake before dawn and be the last to sleep, trusted to run the household in Catherine's absence. Those who saw her in the market said she never wasted words, that her silence seemed heavier than speech, that she carried herself like someone who bore a secret no one dared ask about. She had once had a family of her own before she was sold south, but like many in bondage, she had been forced to bury her past in order to survive. The city outside the Duval gates was full of noise that week, wagons rattling along the cobblestones, vendors shouting their wares, the distant bells of St. Louis Cathedral marking the hours like a heartbeat. But at night, there was a different sound, the deep, mournful call of river boats, the chorus of frogs and crickets rising from the swamps, the kind of sounds that made people speak in hushed tones about spirits and omens. The air was heavy with the smell of the Mississippi, of rain-soaked earth and decaying vegetation, a smell that seeped into every house and seemed to cling to the skin. It was in this setting that Holy Week began for the Duval family, a time meant for penance and prayer, but also a time when tensions ran high, when tempers flared more quickly, when the weight of sin and memory pressed harder on the conscience. For the people of New Orleans, Holy Week was more than a series of church services. It was a ritual cleansing, a chance to wash away a year's worth of transgressions and begin again, purified. But for those who were enslaved, it was also a reminder of the chains that no priest could absolve, the pain no sacrament could erase. Esther moved through the house performing her duties with precision, but there was a stillness to her that some later remembered as unsettling, as though she were listening to something no one else could hear. She lit the candles at dusk, she washed the children's clothes, she prepared the simple meals for the fast days, her hands steady, her face unreadable. Outside, the city continued its preparations for Easter Sunday, its grandest day of celebration, unaware that in one house on Esplanade Avenue, something darker than sin was already taking root. It was a city where wealth bought silence, where priests heard confessions they could never speak of, where violence was buried under lace and white gloves, where every beautiful house seemed to hold some sorrow behind its shutters. The Duval mansion was no different, despite the illusion of perfection it presented to the world. Neighbors later said they felt a chill pass through the street that Good Friday, though they could not say why, only that the air seemed too still, the light too dim, the birds too quiet. Some even claimed they saw Esther standing on the balcony that night, looking out toward the street, her face pale in the moonlight, unmoving for so long they thought she might be a statue. It was in this city, in this charged atmosphere of faith and fear, that the first steps were taken toward what would become one of the most whispered tragedies in New Orleans history, a story that would stain the very earth beneath the Duval house forever. The Duval family were among the oldest Creole names in New Orleans, their lineage stretching back to the first French settlers who had carved their estates out of swamp and cane fields, turning wild land into fortune. Joseph Duval was a man of 43 in the spring of 1858, broad-shouldered, stern-faced, with the calloused hands of someone who had worked alongside his overseers in his youth but who now spent most of his time at his desk or traveling between the city and the plantations upriver. His wealth came from sugar, acres upon acres of cane that fed into the mills and filled the holds of ships bound for Europe. The house on Esplanade was his pride, 3 stories of stucco and shuttered windows, with polished floors imported from France and crystal chandeliers that caught the light of 100 candles during their dinner parties. His wife Catherine was known in the neighborhood as a beauty even into her 30s, her dark hair always pinned perfectly, her dresses tailored in Paris, her manners soft but commanding. Together they had 4 children, Joseph Jr., the eldest at 10, then twin girls Marguerite and Lucille, and the youngest, Pierre, a boy of only 4 who was said to follow Esther like a shadow. The household was large and bustling, with enslaved men and women working in near silence, their presence felt more than heard, their labor the hidden machinery that kept the house running. There was a cook who spent long hours in the sweltering kitchen, a boy who tended the horses, a laundress who worked until her hands cracked, and Esther, who moved between the nursery and the drawing room, who bathed the children, braided their hair, read to them in a low voice when Catherine was too tired. To outsiders, the Duval home was a model of grace, the children well-behaved, the wife devout, the husband generous to the parish. But behind closed doors, life could be harsher. Joseph's temper was known to flare when his business faced losses, and Catherine, for all her refinement, had little patience for disobedience among the servants. Punishments were swift and severe, a reality that kept the house running smoothly, but left scars both seen and unseen. Inside the house, the walls were lined with heavy velvet curtains to keep out the heat, the parlor filled with portraits of ancestors looking down, with solemn expressions as though guarding the family legacy. In the nursery, toys carved from wood and porcelain dolls from France were scattered across the floor, the traces of laughter and play that made the space come alive. It was here that Esther spent most of her hours, her presence as constant as the ticking of the clock on the mantel. The children trusted her implicitly, for she had been the one to comfort them when storms shook the windows, to sit by their beds when they were sick, to hush them when Catherine's nerves demanded silence. If there was any warmth in the house that did not come from the sun, it was to be found in that room, in the quiet bond between caretaker and children. Neighbors often admired the Duval children, remarking on how healthy and well-dressed they were, their curls neat, their manners polished. On Sundays, they were seen walking in a line toward St. Louis Cathedral, Joseph leading, Catherine behind him, the children between them, their little shoes tapping against the stones of the street. At Easter, their pew was adorned with fresh flowers, their voices among the first to rise in song during Mass. But beneath the appearances of order and piety, the Duval family was not untouched by the darker currents of the city. Business had been difficult that year. Rumors of slave uprisings upriver had made Joseph uneasy, and the fever season had already taken several neighbors' children. Catherine herself had been weakened by illness through Lent, her skin pale, her appetite diminished, and there was a growing unease in the household that no one dared speak aloud. Esther had seen more than anyone in the house realized. She had seen Catherine weep in private when news came of another miscarriage the year before, had heard Joseph's voice raised in anger behind closed doors when debts threatened the plantation's profits, had watched the children flinch when tempers snapped during supper. She knew the rhythm of the house better than anyone. She could feel its shifts in mood like the coming of a storm, and in those final days of March, she must have sensed that something was about to change. Servants would later claim they saw her walking the garden alone at dusk, her face turned toward the earth, her lips moving as though in prayer. Some said she had begun humming to herself at night, a low sound that carried through the halls and unsettled the other workers. But no one dared speak to her, not directly. Esther's silence had always been part of her power, a silence that could not be broken even by those who wished to understand her thoughts. The Duval house was a place of contrast, filled with polished beauty and hidden tension, with laughter from the children one moment and the sharp sound of a reprimand the next. It was a house that reflected the city around it, a city where the grand and the grotesque existed side by side, where piety and cruelty could live under the same roof. The family's reputation shielded them from gossip, their status keeping curious eyes at a polite distance. But there were those who said they felt something unsettled in that house even before the tragedy struck, a sense that the air was too heavy, the smiles too forced, that there was a shadow stretching across the threshold, waiting for its moment to fall. Esther had come into the Duval household at a time when her own life had already been stripped bare, sold at auction on a sweltering August morning and led through the streets with chains biting into her wrists. She had been 20 when Joseph purchased her, a young woman from the Carolinas whose price had been set higher because of her strong back and calm manner, the kind of qualities prized for housework. Her children had been sold away before she boarded the steamboat south, a memory that had hollowed her eyes and left her quiet in a way that unsettled even the other enslaved women. In the Duval house, her duties began at dawn, drawing water, tending to the children, scrubbing floors, ironing linens until the fabric shone. But she learned quickly that in this place, silence was survival, that keeping her head lowered and her words few allowed her to endure. Over the years, she became more than just another servant. She became a fixture, someone the children clung to when Catherine was away, someone trusted to keep the household steady when tempers flared. Yet no one could say they truly knew her heart. There was a stillness about Esther that made people pause. She moved through the house with a deliberate grace, her steps soft, her hands sure, her face unreadable. To the other servants, she was both a comfort and a mystery, one who rarely joined in their whispered conversations but who would leave bits of food at their doors when rations ran thin, one who stayed up through the night when fever came to the quarters, praying softly over the sick. Some said she had the sight, that she dreamed of things before they happened, that she knew when death was coming for someone in the house because she would light a candle in the kitchen without being asked. The Duval children adored her, especially little Pierre, who followed her from room to room, clutching at her skirts, demanding to be held until she scooped him into her arms and carried him about her chores. To Catherine she was useful, almost indispensable, though never above reproach. To Joseph she was property, another line in the ledger, yet he valued her steadiness and had spared her the fields, a small mercy in a life otherwise bound by chains. What no one saw were the moments when Esther was alone, standing by the window after the house had gone to sleep, staring out into the night with a look that seemed to belong to another world. She would sometimes hum to herself in a low, mournful tone, songs that were neither fully hymns nor the call and response chants of the quarters. Something older, something that seemed to pull the air taut around her. Those who heard her humming swore it made their skin prickle, as if the house itself was listening. She kept a small bundle beneath her sleeping mat, a collection of bones and beads and bits of cloth that she handled with reverence. No one dared touch it, but some whispered that it was a charm, a talisman for protection or vengeance, a quiet act of resistance hidden in plain sight. When the other servants spoke of her, they did so with a mixture of fear and respect, as though she stood closer to the edge of the world than any of them. As Holy Week approached that year, Esther's behavior began to shift in ways that drew uneasy glances. She grew even quieter, her eyes more distant, her movements slower, as if weighed down by something unseen. She spent longer hours in the garden, sometimes kneeling in the dirt as though she were tending to plants no one else could see, her hands pressed flat to the ground. At night, the humming grew louder, and once, a kitchen boy claimed to have seen her standing in the dark with her hands lifted as though speaking to someone who was not there. The boy told no one until much later, after the tragedy, when every memory seemed to carry new weight. Catherine, weakened by her illness, barely noticed, and Joseph was away too often to pay attention. But the children noticed. Joseph Jr. asked why Esther seemed sad, why she didn't sing to them as she used to, but she only touched his cheek and told him to sleep. There were those who later wondered if Esther had reached a breaking point, if the weight of years in bondage, the loss of her own children, the endless labor and the silence she carried had finally become too heavy. Some believed she was planning something long before Good Friday came, that every quiet step, every night spent awake, was a preparation for what she would do. Others argued she had fallen under some dark influence, that her mind had been seized by grief or by something darker than grief, that the spirits she whispered to in the garden had finally answered. Whatever the truth, no one in that house recognized how close they stood to the edge, how near they were to the moment when all the order and beauty of the Duval household would be turned to horror. Esther kept her counsel, kept her silence, and moved among them like a shadow, her face calm, her hands steady, her secret growing heavier with every passing day, waiting for the hour when it could no longer be contained. Holy Week settled over New Orleans like a shroud, the air growing heavy with incense and rain, the streets quieter as the faithful moved in procession toward the cathedral. In the Duval house the days seemed to stretch longer, each one marked by ritual and restraint. The bells of St. Louis tolled in the distance, their low peal carrying over the rooftops, reminding the city of penance, sacrifice, and death. Catherine remained confined to her room, her fever worsening, her face damp with sweat as Esther tended to her in silence, bringing cool cloths, preparing broths, keeping the windows open for air. Joseph was gone again, called away by urgent business upriver, leaving the house in Esther's hands. The children's laughter, which had once filled the halls, became subdued. Their games played more softly, as though they too felt the weight of the week pressing down on them. The household moved in a strange quiet, broken only by the rustle of skirts, the faint sound of prayer from Catherine's room, the creak of wooden steps as the servants went about their work. Each night the sky seemed darker, the clouds hanging low, the air thick with the smell of the river and the coming storm. On Holy Thursday, the city gathered for Mass of the Last Supper, candles flickering in the cathedral, feet washed in solemn ceremony, but in the Duval house, Esther stayed behind, keeping watch over the children, lighting candles of her own in the kitchen and whispering words no one else could hear. The other servants said they felt uneasy that night, as though something in the air had shifted, the house itself listening and waiting. The children clung to her skirts as she moved from room to room, unwilling to sleep until she sang to them, her voice low, the melody slow and mournful, carrying a note of finality that made the hairs rise on their arms. In the garden, the soil lay freshly turned from the spring planting, the scent of earth sharp in the night air, and some swore they saw Esther standing there alone after midnight, her figure still against the pale moonlight. Good Friday dawned, grey and wet, the sky heavy with rain that never quite fell, a day that felt suspended between earth and heaven. The bells tolled again, slower this time, their sound carried on the damp wind, and the city seemed to hold its breath. In the Duval house, the children were dressed in their plainest clothes, their play kept quiet, their meals sparse. Catherine's condition worsened, leaving her unable to rise from her bed, her rosary clutched tight in one hand as she whispered prayers for redemption. Esther moved through the house with the same steady grace she always had. Yet there was a difference now, a tension in her shoulders, a watchfulness in her eyes. She gathered the children in the nursery after the midday meal, closing the shutters against the growing storm outside, and for a time the house was silent except for the sound of her voice, speaking to them in words too soft for anyone else to hear. By afternoon, the house felt unnaturally still. The cook reported that the birds in the garden had gone quiet, their songs replaced by the low roll of distant thunder. A servant boy said he saw Esther leading the children out into the yard just before dusk, their small hands clasped in hers, their faces solemn as though they were being led to some sacred rite. He did not follow, afraid of what he might see. When night came, the storm finally broke, rain lashing against the shutters, wind rattling the gates, thunder shaking the chandeliers. In Catherine's room, the fever dream carried her far from the sounds of the house, and in the nursery, the beds lay empty. By the time Easter morning arrived, the house had taken on an unnatural quiet, the kind that made the servants exchange fearful glances as they moved through the halls. The children were nowhere to be found, their toys still scattered across the floor, their shoes by the door, as though they had vanished in the middle of play. Catherine, too weak to rise, asked for them again and again, her voice breaking when no one answered. Word was sent to Joseph upriver, and neighbors began to arrive, their faces tight with concern, their eyes darting toward the garden as though drawn there by some unspoken knowledge. The house that had once been full of sound was now filled with the echo of absence, the stillness more terrifying than any scream. The servants whispered among themselves that something had happened in the night, something they could not name, something that had changed Esther forever, for she did not cry out, did not search, did not ask where the children had gone. She simply stood in the doorway, her face calm, her hands folded, as though she had been waiting for this moment all along. The search began at once, the house erupting into frantic motion after days of oppressive quiet. Neighbors poured through the gates, lanterns swinging in the early light, their boots sinking into the wet earth as they fanned out across the garden and yard. Servants scoured the stables, the laundry house, the kitchen, their fear growing with every corner they turned and found empty. Joseph returned before noon, his carriage splattered with mud, his face pale as he took in the stillness of the house. He called the children's names until his voice cracked, striding from room to room, overturning chairs in his desperation. Catherine's cries echoed from upstairs, her body too weak to rise, demanding news, begging someone to tell her the children were only hiding, that they had not been taken. But hour by hour, the truth became harder to deny. The city guard was summoned, neighbors whispering prayers as they walked the perimeter of the property, the bells of St. Louis tolling in the distance as though mourning ahead of time. By afternoon, all eyes turned to Esther. She had not joined the search, had not spoken since dawn, standing instead in the doorway that led to the garden, her posture rigid, her face unreadable. Some urged her to speak, to tell them what she knew, but she only glanced toward the far end of the yard where the soil had been freshly disturbed during the spring planting. It was Joseph who seized her by the shoulders, shaking her until her head lolled, demanding to know where his children were. She did not resist, did not cry, only lifted one hand and pointed toward the back of the property. A terrible silence fell as the men took up shovels and began to dig. The earth was soft from the rain, clinging to their hands and clothes as they worked, the sound of metal striking soil ringing out like a grim bell. Catherine's wails could be heard from the house as though she already knew what they would find. The first small form appeared just after dusk, the tiny shoe of Pierre visible through the clotted earth. A cry went up from one of the neighbors, and Joseph dropped to his knees, clawing at the dirt with his bare hands. One by one the children were uncovered, their bodies laid carefully side by side, their faces pale but unmarked, their hands still clasped together. The sight was too much for some, several women turning away, clutching at rosaries, whispering that it would have been better had they been taken by fever than by this. The coroner was summoned, his lantern casting long shadows as he knelt to examine them, his face grim as he concluded they had not died from blows or poison, but from suffocation, the air cut off before their small lungs could fill again. The realization spread through the gathered crowd like a cold wind. The children had been alive when they were placed in the earth. Joseph's grief became rage. He turned on Esther where she stood at the edge of the pit, her face still calm, her hands folded as though in prayer. Neighbors shouted that she should be bound, that she should be taken at once to the jail, that such an act could not go unanswered. But Esther did not run, did not plead. Witnesses later said she stared past them all, her gaze fixed on the night sky as though listening to some distant voice. Even as Joseph struck her across the face, she did not fall, did not utter a sound. When they bound her wrists, she offered them willingly, allowing herself to be led back toward the house, her steps slow and deliberate, her expression unchanged. Some swore that as she passed the graves, she whispered something under her breath, words no one could quite make out, words that made even the bravest man present feel the hair rise on his neck. The bodies of the children were brought inside and laid in the parlor, candles lit around them, their pale faces illuminated in the flickering light. The house filled with the sound of weeping, Catherine's sobs punctuated by prayers recited in a shaking voice. Outside, the rain began again, washing the fresh soil back into the pit, blurring the edges of the grave until it looked as though the earth had tried to swallow the evidence of what had been done. Neighbors lingered on the porch, some refusing to go home, unwilling to leave the Duval family alone with their grief. The air inside the house grew thick with the smell of wax and wet earth, with the faint copper tang of the river air drifting in through the open windows. Esther remained under guard in the kitchen, sitting motionless on a wooden stool, her wrists bound, her eyes half closed as though she were in a trance. Rumors began to spread before dawn, carried down Esplanade Avenue by servants and visitors who had witnessed the unearthing. Some claimed Esther had confessed, others said she had not spoken a word, that she had only smiled faintly when asked why she had done it. The story grew darker with every telling, neighbors insisting she had been touched by madness, that she had been practicing dark rites in the garden, that she had heard the voice of some spirit commanding her to return the Master's children to the earth. By the time the first light of Easter Sunday touched the city, the Duval house had become the center of a storm, its gates watched by curious crowds, its name whispered in horror. Inside, Joseph knelt beside the bodies of his children, his hands stained with dirt, his mind consumed by the image of the shallow grave, and in the kitchen, Esther waited in silence, the shadows around her seeming to lengthen with every passing hour. As Easter morning dawned, the streets of New Orleans filled with churchgoers dressed in their finest, the bells of St. Louis Cathedral ringing out in solemn celebration of resurrection. But in the Duval house, there was no rejoicing, only a suffocating silence broken by the low sound of grief. The parlor was lit with dozens of candles, their flames shivering in the early light, casting the children's faces in a pale, almost holy glow as they lay side by side on the polished floor. Catherine was carried down from her room to see them, her body weak, her hands trembling as she touched each small face, whispering prayers so softly they were almost breathless. Joseph stood apart, staring at the four still forms with a hollow look, his jaw clenched so tight that the muscles twitched in his cheeks. The neighbors had gathered again, some kneeling in the hall, some standing outside the windows, their expressions a mix of sorrow and fear, their whispers of what should be done with Esther growing louder with every passing hour. Esther herself was kept under watch, sitting in a wooden chair near the kitchen hearth, her wrists still bound, her posture straight despite the exhaustion that must have been creeping into her bones. She did not look at those who guarded her, did not plead for forgiveness, did not shed a tear. Some swore she seemed almost peaceful, her lips moving in soundless words, as though she were carrying on a conversation with someone unseen. The cook, who had known her longer than anyone, said later that there was a look on Esther's face that chilled her more than any display of rage or sorrow could have, the look of someone who had accepted her fate long before it arrived. When asked why she had done it, she gave no answer, only lowered her eyes to the floor, as if the question itself was too small for the weight of what she had carried. By midday, word of the crime had spread beyond Esplanade Avenue, drawing curious onlookers from other parts of the city. Some came to offer prayers, others merely to stare, as though the house had become a place of morbid pilgrimage. There were those who muttered that such a thing could only be the work of a cursed spirit, that Esther had been touched by dark magic, that she had called down something inhuman to guide her hands. Others, more practical, said she had gone mad from grief, that the memory of her own children had twisted into vengeance, that she had sought to make the Duvals feel the same hollow pain she had been forced to live with. But no explanation seemed to soothe the raw wound left in the household. No theory could lessen the sight of the four small coffins that were now being prepared. When the coroner's cart arrived to carry the children to the cemetery, Catherine nearly collapsed, clinging to Joseph as if she could keep them there by sheer force of will. Joseph followed the coffins on foot, his boots sinking into the wet earth, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of his grief pressed him down. The servants followed at a distance, their faces solemn, none daring to meet Esther's eyes as they passed. She was left behind, still seated in the kitchen, the sound of the departing procession fading until the house was once again nearly silent. The guards shifted uneasily in the doorway, glancing at one another as though they feared to remain alone with her. Even bound, Esther seemed to fill the space, her stillness a presence that made the air feel heavier, the shadows darker. One of the guards swore later that when he turned his back, he heard her whispering in a language he did not recognize, the sound rising and falling like a lullaby. Night came without relief, the house still thick with the smell of wax and damp earth, the floorboards creaking under the restless feet of those who could not sleep. Joseph returned from the cemetery close to midnight, his face hollow, his clothes stained with mud. He ordered that Esther be taken to the city jail at first light, that she face judgment for what she had done. But as the first hint of dawn touched the sky, when the guards went to fetch her from the kitchen, they found the chair empty. The ropes that had bound her wrists lay neatly coiled on the floor, the door bolted from within as though no human hand had opened it. A search was mounted immediately, the house turned upside down, the grounds scoured, the road watched, but there was no sign of Esther. It was as though she had been swallowed by the night itself, leaving behind only the faint smell of earth and candle smoke. In the days that followed, sightings were reported throughout the city. A woman in a dark shawl seen walking along the levee at dusk, a figure glimpsed in the St. Louis cemetery kneeling among the tombs, a shadow passing through the French market before disappearing into the crowd. None could be confirmed, and none lasted long enough for her to be caught. For the Duval family, her disappearance was almost worse than her presence, for it meant she might still be out there, might return, might haunt them in ways they could not predict. Catherine left New Orleans within the year, traveling to France in search of peace, but she never returned, dying in Paris 2 winters later. Joseph sold the house and moved upriver, but the mansion never lost the stain of what had happened. Neighbors said that during Holy Week, candles would sometimes light themselves in the windows, that faint sounds of crying could be heard in the garden where the graves had been, that a woman's silhouette could be seen standing on the balcony under the moon, as though still keeping watch over the house she had once turned into a tomb. In the years that followed, the story of Esther became something darker than memory, something closer to a legend that crept through the streets of New Orleans, like the fog that rolled in from the river. Children were warned not to wander near Esplanade Avenue at night, not to linger by the Duval house, which stood empty for many years, its shutters banging in the wind, its garden overgrown until it resembled a graveyard more than a home. Some claimed to have seen a woman standing in the upstairs window when the moon was high, her figure outlined in pale silver light, her face hidden, but her posture unmistakable. The priests of St. Louis Cathedral spoke of the incident in hushed tones, saying it was a cautionary tale about vengeance, a reminder that sin breeds more sin, but others saw it differently, whispering that Esther had done what no law would ever have allowed her to do, that she had taken back power from a family who had taken everything from her. Among the city's enslaved population, Esther's name became a quiet rallying point, spoken in kitchens and back rooms, in whispers between laundry lines and market stalls. Some said she had been guided by spirits, that the ancestors had told her what to do, that she had been chosen to deliver a warning to those who owned human lives. Others believed she was still alive, walking the edges of the bayou, waiting for another Holy Week to come again so she could finish what she had started. Rumors spread of strange happenings in other plantations upriver, animals found dead without cause, children waking from nightmares, screaming of a woman with earth-stained hands standing at the foot of their bed, household crosses falling from the walls with no wind to move them. It was said that wherever such things occurred, someone would find a patch of freshly dug soil somewhere on the property, as though a grave had been started and left empty. When the house was finally sold, the new owners attempted to cleanse it, bringing in a priest to bless the rooms and hiring workers to tear up the old floorboards where the children's bodies had once been laid. The workers refused to stay after dark, claiming they heard footsteps on the stairs when no one was there, that they smelled damp soil even though the boards had been replaced. One man swore he heard a woman humming softly in the nursery, the same room where the children had slept, and that the sound stopped the moment he crossed the threshold. After the house was restored, it became a fashionable address once more, but its reputation never fully recovered. Guests at dinner parties sometimes reported sudden drafts, the candles snuffing out all at once, and a heavy silence falling over the room until someone nervously broke it with laughter.